In a remote village deep in the African wilderness, a woman named Imani lived a life filled with mystery and superstition. Known for her deep connection with nature, Imani was feared by the villagers, not because of her actions, but because of a strange and chilling event that had followed her for years. Every night, she would cry out in her sleep, but what she screamed was enough to make the bravest men tremble. She cried out for snakes. No one knew why, but her cries were so real that many believed they were a warning, a prophecy of doom. As the village began to unravel the terrifying truth behind Imani's haunting cries, they soon realized that the snakes were not just in her dreams, they were closer than anyone could have imagined. Imani was a woman shrouded in mystery, living on the outskirts of a small African village nestled deep within the dense jungle. Her house, though modest, was set at the edge of the forest, where the natural world felt close, almost alive with secrets. The villagers often spoke of her in hushed tones, some saying she was a healer, others claiming she had made a pact with the spirits of the jungle, and some even believed she was cursed. But whatever they thought of her, one thing was undeniable: there was something haunting about her, something no one could quite put their finger on. Imani had always been a solitary figure. Unlike the other women in the village who would gather together to share stories, exchange gossip, and enjoy the sense of community, Imani kept to herself. She would wander the forest, speaking to the trees, touching the earth, and listening to the sounds of nature. Her days were spent in quiet meditation, as if she was in constant conversation with the spirits of the land. While this fascinated some of the villagers, it also made others uncomfortable. They couldn't quite figure her out, and so they kept their distance. But what truly set Imani apart from the others were the terrifying cries that echoed through the village each night. These weren't ordinary cries of sadness or despair, they were something more primal, more unsettling. Every night, just as the moon rose high in the sky, the villagers would hear Imani's voice piercing the stillness. Her cries weren't filled with words but with one chilling refrain, repeated again and again: snakes. Snakes, they are coming. They will devour us all. At first, the villagers thought little of it. They assumed that it was merely the ramblings of a woman who lived alone in the jungle, perhaps tormented by dreams or the ghost of her past. But as the nights went on, the intensity of Imani's cries grew. She screamed as if she were in the grip of some otherworldly force, her voice echoing across the village, sending shivers down the spines of those who heard it. Her cries were not just the sound of a woman in distress, they were a warning, a prophecy, and they left the villagers shaken. What was even more disturbing was that no one had ever seen Imani shed a tear. Despite the depth of her cries, there was no visible sign of grief or sadness in her eyes. It was as though the woman was in a trance, caught between the world of the living and the spirit world. The villagers could not understand why she cried out for snakes, nor could they make sense of what she meant. Were the snakes a metaphor for something greater? Or was there an actual threat coming to the village? The questions lingered in the air, unanswered, as the villagers grew more and more afraid. The elders of the village, who were typically unshaken by most superstitions, began to take Imani's cries seriously. They feared that something dark was coming, something that Imani had seen in her dreams or had received from the spirits. They decided to confront her and ask her directly about the source of her alarming visions. Perhaps, they thought, she could give them answers to calm their growing fears. But when they approached her, she was as calm as ever. She didn't speak of the cries as though they were extraordinary, but simply as a part of her nightly routine. To the elders, it seemed as if Imani herself was caught in some kind of spiritual struggle, but they couldn't figure out how to help her. The villagers, although initially fearful, began to become more curious about Imani's situation. Children would sneak up to her house to listen to her cries in the dead of night, fascinated by the mystery surrounding her. Some began to speculate that she was cursed, others that she was somehow connected to the spirit world, but none could answer why it was always snakes that she screamed about. The longer her cries continued, the more the villagers began to believe that something more sinister was at play, and the more they feared the possibility of a snake infestation in the village. Perhaps, they thought, the snakes were a metaphor for something much darker, a warning from the gods or the spirits of the jungle. What added to the growing fear was that despite the passage of time, Imani never seemed to grow weaker or show signs of exhaustion. It was as if she were possessed by the very force that caused her to cry out in the dead of night. No matter how much the villagers tried to talk to her, to calm her, she would only repeat the same words in a trance-like state: "Snakes are coming. They will devour us all." There was no escaping the terrifying images her cries evoked. The image of snakes, coiled and ready to strike, loomed over the village like an ominous cloud. Despite their attempts to help, the villagers were left with no answers. They felt helpless in the face of Imani's powerful, unshakable belief that something terrible was coming. As time passed, the cries grew more frequent, and the village's anxiety reached a fever pitch. What could it mean? Were the snakes truly a symbol of some impending doom? Or was it a sign of something deeper that no one could yet understand? What the villagers didn't know, however, was that Imani's cries were not just a random occurrence. They were the beginning of something much larger, something that would change the fate of the village forever. The answer to her cries, and the mystery behind her warnings, lay hidden in the secrets of the jungle, and soon, the villagers would come face to face with the very thing they had been too afraid to confront. Imani's haunting cries, which had once seemed like mere madness, were the first warning of a tragedy that would leave the entire village stunned and forever changed. The true meaning of her words would soon become clear, and with it, the truth about the woman who had cried out for snakes. As the days passed, the village became more and more unsettled by Imani's eerie cries. What had started as a strange occurrence in the night soon grew into a terrifying, uncontrollable ritual. Each evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the village settled into darkness, the chilling sound of Imani's voice echoed through the air. Her cry was unmistakable and terrifying: "Snakes! Snakes, they are coming! They will devour us all." Her voice would tremble with fear and urgency, causing a ripple of unease throughout the village. Yet, despite the intensity of her warnings, the villagers didn't know how to react. They didn't understand why she was so sure, nor did they know how to help her, or themselves. The villagers were caught between a deep sense of dread and confusion. The cries had become so frequent and persistent that the once quiet village had begun to feel like a place of constant unrest. Every night, families huddled together in their homes, clutching their children and glancing nervously at the door, as if expecting the snakes to arrive at any moment. The air was thick with fear, but no one knew what to do. It was as though an invisible force had cast a spell over the village, filling the hearts of the villagers with an irrational terror that they couldn't shake. Some villagers tried to dismiss Imani's warnings, attributing her cries to madness or some form of delusion. They believed that she had become a victim of her own fears, that her mind had become unhinged after years of isolation. They believed she was simply imagining things, and the villagers discussed her in hushed tones, unsure of whether they should be concerned or just let her continue her strange behavior. Others, particularly the elders, were more cautious. They were aware of the old traditions and stories about spirits and the jungle's deep, hidden power. These elders believed there might be more to Imani's warnings than simple madness, but they didn't want to create panic without knowing the full truth. As time went on, the villagers began to notice something even stranger. The animals around the village, once abundant and lively, began to act erratically. Herds of goats and cattle were found dead, their bodies limp and cold, with no visible injuries. Wild animals from the jungle seemed to avoid the outskirts of the village entirely, as though they were being driven away by some unseen force. The skies grew strangely still, and the village was filled with an unnerving quiet that only deepened the sense of dread. Despite the outward signs of something terrible occurring, the villagers remained unsure of what exactly was happening. Was this a coincidence, Or was Imani's warning true? Had she foreseen something dark that was yet to come? Imani, for her part, remained as enigmatic as ever. She did not try to calm the villagers or offer them any explanations. In fact, she continued to live in isolation, rarely seen during the day, and only coming out to visit the river at sunset. Her demeanor had grown even more solemn, and her previously calm expressions had shifted to something more distant, as if she were constantly listening to something only she could hear. She no longer cried out in panic, but her silence only added to the growing sense of fear. Her once troubled voice had gone quiet, replaced by a steady sense of resolve that made the villagers even more uneasy. Rumors began to spread. Some villagers said that the snakes she spoke of were no ordinary reptiles. They were supernatural, vengeful spirits in the form of serpents, sent to punish the village for unknown transgressions. Others believed that Imani had made some kind of pact with the spirits of the jungle, that she had unleashed the snakes as a form of retribution for a past wrongdoing. Whatever the case, the idea of the snakes loomed large in the minds of the villagers, as they started to fear their inevitable arrival. One evening, a group of the younger men from the village decided to confront Imani. They were terrified, yes, but they also wanted answers. They had seen the strange happenings around the village, the dead animals, the eerie silence, and now, the way the very land seemed to be shrinking away from them. Something had to be done. They approached Imani's small hut with caution, nervous about what they might find. But when they arrived, they were greeted by an unexpected sight. Imani was sitting by the river, her eyes closed, as if she were meditating. The men stood frozen, watching her as they tried to decide how to approach her. When one of them finally spoke, Imani opened her eyes slowly, and for the first time in weeks, she met their gaze. Her face was calm, almost serene, but there was something in her eyes, something deep and knowing, that sent a chill down their spines. "You've come for answers, haven't you?" Imani asked quietly, her voice steady and unyielding. The men hesitated, unsure of what to say. Finally, one of them spoke. "What's happening to the village, Imani? Why do you speak of snakes? Why do you cry out in such terror every night?" Imani remained silent for a moment, as if weighing her words carefully. Then she spoke again, her voice low and measured. "The snakes are real," she said. "They are not a threat to your bodies, they are a threat to your souls. And they have come because of something your ancestors did." The men looked at each other, confused and frightened by her words. But before they could ask any more questions, Imani stood up and turned away from them. "The time will come when you will understand. But for now, all you can do is wait and prepare." Imani's cryptic message left the men more disturbed than ever. As they walked back to the village, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were witnessing the beginning of something much darker than they had ever imagined. The more they thought about Imani's words, the more they began to understand, the snakes were not simply a physical threat. They were a manifestation of a deeper, spiritual reckoning. Whatever the village had done to anger the spirits of the jungle, the consequences were now upon them. Imani's warnings had always been unsettling, but now they seemed like an omen. The village, once a peaceful and thriving community, was on the edge of something far greater than they could comprehend. The snakes, it seemed, were not just coming, they had already arrived, hidden in plain sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. And the true horror of their presence was something no one was prepared for. As the days stretched into weeks, the village grew increasingly anxious. What had begun as a series of unsettling dreams and warnings from Imani had now become a reality. The once peaceful community, tucked away in the heart of the African wilderness, was starting to feel as if the very land beneath their feet was rejecting them. The air was thick with unease, and the once bustling market square had become eerily quiet. The villagers could feel the weight of something terrible bearing down on them, and with every passing day, their fear only deepened. Imani's warning about the snakes was no longer a distant, vague threat. The effects were now evident in the village. The animals, both domesticated and wild, seemed to be vanishing. At first, it was small things, chickens disappearing from their coops, goats gone without a trace. But it wasn't long before the larger animals, cattle, antelope, even lions, began to vanish as well. The villagers were puzzled. There were no tracks, no signs of struggle, no explanation for the sudden disappearances. It was as though the creatures were being pulled into the earth itself, leaving no trace behind. But the most troubling signs were those that came at night. The first time the villagers encountered the snakes, it was not in the form they had expected. They were not large, menacing creatures, slithering through the market or invading homes. Instead, they came as shadows, dark, twisting shapes that moved silently through the village under the cover of darkness. The snakes did not strike, they simply watched. And their eyes, glowing a faint yellow, were the most terrifying part. They were not just animals, they seemed to be sentient, aware of the fear they were instilling. As night after night passed, the villagers began to hear strange noises, hissing sounds that echoed through the trees, growing louder and more frequent as time went on. But no one ever saw the snakes during the day. They had become like a ghostly presence, lurking just beyond the reach of sight. The sound of them hissing in the darkness grew so constant that it became impossible to ignore. No one could sleep, no one could escape the feeling that something sinister was afoot. The elders, who had spent their lives studying the traditions and history of their people, began to fear the worst. They had heard stories of ancient curses, of spirits trapped in the earth and brought to life by the anger of the gods. They believed that the snakes were not merely animals but manifestations of a much darker force, a punishment from the spirits of the jungle for some ancient sin committed by the village's ancestors. They recalled the old stories that warned of the wrath of the serpent gods, who had once ruled the land before being cast out by their forefathers. It seemed as if the very sins of the past were now coming to life, and the village was paying the price. Imani, though, seemed to know something the others did not. As the villagers grew more desperate and began to organize a plan to protect themselves, Imani remained oddly calm. She spoke little, but when she did, her words were cryptic, almost as if she had been waiting for this moment her entire life. The villagers didn't know what to make of her. Some saw her as the key to understanding what was happening, while others feared she might be the cause of the whole calamity. After all, she was the one who had cried out about the snakes in the first place. One evening, a small group of villagers gathered in front of Imani's hut, determined to get answers. They had heard enough of her mysterious words and cryptic warnings. They demanded to know why she had been calling out in her sleep and what it had all meant. Was she somehow connected to the snakes? Was she the one who had awakened them? Imani's response was calm, her voice steady as she stood before the group. You seek answers, but the truth is not something that can be simply spoken. You must understand that the snakes you fear are not just creatures, they are messengers, symbols of a balance that has been disrupted. Her words hung in the air, leaving the villagers unsure of what she meant. She continued, the snakes are here because something has been forgotten, something that has lain dormant in the jungle for generations. Imani spoke of the serpent gods, ancient beings that had once ruled the land. The villagers, in their quest for survival, had unwittingly broken a sacred pact made by their ancestors to leave the serpent gods in peace. It was not the villagers themselves who had caused the wrath of the snakes but the breaking of an ancient agreement, long buried in the past. The gods had been banished, and the snakes, their messengers, were sent to restore balance by exacting punishment. The villagers were stunned by this revelation. They had heard stories of the serpent gods, but they were just that, stories. Myths passed down through generations, almost forgotten in the face of modern life. But now, standing before Imani, they realized that these stories were not just tales meant to entertain, they were warnings, messages from a time long past. And now, the snakes were here to collect. Imani's face was somber as she told the villagers what they needed to do. The only way to stop the curse, to end the reign of the snakes, was to make amends for the sins of their ancestors. The village needed to offer a sacrifice, one that would appease the serpent gods and restore peace. But the price would not be small. The sacrifice required someone willing to give up everything, to surrender themselves to the gods as a sign of repentance. Imani's voice faltered for a moment, as she knew what this would mean. The sacrifice was her. The villagers were horrified, but Imani explained that this was the only way to stop the wrath of the snakes. She had been chosen, not by the gods, but by fate itself. Her bloodline was linked to the ancient pact, and it was only through her sacrifice that the curse could be lifted. Her decision was not one of fear, but of duty. She had spent her life preparing for this moment, and now it was time to honor the pact and save the village. As the sun began to set on the villagers knew that a moment of great change was upon them. What had started as a terrifying and incomprehensible event was now coming to a head. The snakes were real. The spirits were angry. And only one woman, Imani, had the strength to face the consequences. The days following Imani's revelation passed in a haze of uncertainty and fear. The village was torn between disbelief and dread, unable to fully grasp the magnitude of the situation. While some believed that Imani's words about the serpent gods and the broken pact were nothing but superstition, others felt the weight of the truth in her voice. The strange occurrences, the vanishing animals, the terrifying cries in the night, and the snakes lurking in the shadows, were too coincidental to ignore. The village had been caught in something far greater than they had ever imagined, and they now stood at the edge of a precipice. Imani, however, was resolute. She had known for years that this day would come. She had lived with the knowledge that her bloodline was tied to the ancient curse, that the sins of the past would one day resurface, demanding retribution. She had always feared this moment, but now that it had arrived, she felt a strange sense of peace. She was no longer afraid of the snakes, nor of the sacrifice she had to make. She knew what had to be done, and there was no turning back. The villagers, though, were not so sure. They had grown up hearing the stories of the serpent gods, but to them, they were just myths, stories to be told around the fire. They had never imagined that those stories could be real, let alone that they might be part of the reason their village was suffering. Now that Imani had spoken the truth, the weight of her words was sinking in. The snakes, the death of animals, the eerie silence that had taken over the village, all of it pointed to something far beyond their understanding. Imani's decision to offer herself as a sacrifice was met with resistance, especially from her closest friends and family. They could not bear the thought of losing her. She had always been a pillar of strength for the village, and to lose her would feel like the death of their community. Her mother, now an elderly woman, wept bitterly at the thought of losing her daughter, pleading with her to reconsider. The villagers, too, gathered in desperation, attempting to find another way, but Imani remained firm. She explained to them that it was her fate, that the serpent gods would not relent unless the balance was restored, and that her bloodline had to pay the price for the sins of the past. As the village prepared for the ritual, there was a sense of mourning that hung in the air. The reality of the situation was undeniable. The people of the village knew that the only way to stop the curse was to honor Imani's decision, to send her to the serpent gods to make amends for their ancestors. But as they gathered around her, their hearts were heavy, filled with sorrow at the loss of the woman who had been so integral to their lives. They had witnessed her strength and resilience, and now they had to bear witness to her ultimate sacrifice. The day of the ritual arrived, and the village gathered in the clearing by the river, where the ancient temple ruins stood. It was the site where the serpent gods had once been worshipped, and it was here that the final offering would be made. The air was thick with anticipation, and the villagers stood in silence as they watched Imani approach the altar. Her face was calm, her eyes filled with determination. There was no fear in her expression, only acceptance of the role she had to play in restoring balance. Imani knelt before the altar, her hands outstretched as the villagers gathered around her, forming a circle of support and solidarity. She closed her eyes, allowing herself to become one with the spirits of the land, to feel the presence of the ancient gods that had long been forgotten. The air grew thick with energy, and the ground beneath them seemed to hum with the power of the ritual. The snakes, which had been lurking in the shadows, began to emerge, their eyes glowing with a faint, eerie light. They slithered toward Imani, and as they did, the villagers could feel the weight of their presence. The power of the serpent gods was unmistakable. Imani raised her voice, calling out to the gods. Her words were spoken in the ancient language of her ancestors, a language that had been lost to time, but one that she had been taught in secret. The ritual had begun, and with it came the realization that this was not just a sacrifice for the village, it was a final act of redemption, not only for her but for her people. Her ancestors had broken the pact, and now she was here to make it right. The snakes, in response to her invocation, began to circle her, their movements graceful and deliberate. They were not attacking, they were accepting her offering, acknowledging her sacrifice. As the ritual reached its peak, the sky above the village grew dark. The air was thick with tension, and the villagers could feel the ground beneath their feet shift. The snake god's presence was felt by all, and it was as if time itself had stopped. The villagers held their breath, watching in awe and fear as Imani's body began to glow with an otherworldly light. She was no longer just a woman, she was a vessel for something greater, a living conduit between the earth and the divine. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, the ritual was over. The snakes retreated back into the jungle, and the earth returned to its natural state. The sky cleared, and the air felt lighter, as if the curse had been lifted. Imani remained kneeling before the altar, her body still glowing, her face serene. The villagers stood in silence, unsure of what to say or do. They had witnessed a moment of true power, of sacrifice and redemption. They had lost a beloved member of their community, but in return, they had been saved from the wrath of the serpent gods. Imani's sacrifice marked the end of the curse, and the village slowly began to heal. The snakes never returned, and the once vibrant land flourished once again. But the memory of Imani's bravery and sacrifice would never fade. The villagers, having witnessed the power of the serpent gods and the strength of Imani's spirit, would forever honor her legacy. The woman who had cried out snakes had become a symbol of courage, sacrifice, and the deep connection between the people and the forces of nature.